her wearing a purple robe. With no preamble, he signaled her to undress. Oksana did it carefully, without fear, as if she were going to take a bath. She barely trembled. The Korean approached, sniffing her armpits and sex, then caressed or more accurately felt her muscles, her nipples and her buttocks, as if he were examining a horse. His fingers were long and cold, but the rest of his body possessed a sweet, almost feminine warmth. Oksana couldn't resist. It was the first time she would sleep with a man. The Korean paused to observe the scars on her thighs and forearms without understanding their meaning. He measured the wounds with the tip of his fingers as if they were still open. Only then did he lead to her bed. Oksana never protested. She would have followed him anywhere. She tried to kiss him, but he covered her mouth. What could he want? What could he want? He then placed her on the sheets as if she were a doll, removed his robe, and sweetly stretched out on top of her. Oksana tried to caress him, but again he rejected her. She barely felt the Korean's body on top of her own. He was weightless, like a phantom, like a newborn. He rubbed against her skin awkwardly, vainly trying to excite himself. Finally, he let off, put off his robe again, handed Oksana a 100 banknote, she'd never seen one before, and let her leave. That night, Oksana dreamed of a tiger without claws. The next day, she waited for the Korean to reappear in the dive down the port. She looked for him among the shadows, blinded by the lights shining on her face and guitar, and even tried to invoke him with her songs. Waiting for him gives me more pleasure than having a good time with someone else. Oksana was ecstatic because of the Korean. She imagined him on top of her, alone and sad, mute, denied pleasure. Who could this unfortunate creature be? Why would he take notice of her? Why would he choose her? Why had he paid for his consolation? Ever since she came to Vladivostok, Oksana had drowned herself in the skin of other women, pale, moribund females with no identity or history, typical frontier types. Most were, like her, artists, but there were also workers and secretaries, mothers and wives, and even a model married to a celebrated mafioso. All of them had satisfied her desire. All of them had revived her. All of them had allowed her to discover herself, but none had obsessed her as he did, a powerful, impotent man, a male who in bed was not different from a woman. Who was that Korean who came in here a few days ago? She asked Kornei Ivanovich, owner of the dive. It's probably better you don't know, he answered, as obtuse as usual. Know where I can find him? It's probably better you don't look for him. Vladivostok is the last port in the world, Oksana wrote in her blue notebook. The far end of civilization, the end of the world. More than a diary, Oksana was writing a mixed series of aphorisms, poems, songs, stories, and scattered fragments, all addressed to her adored Anna Akhmatova, whose picture watched over her work time. The poet was still Oksana's guide, her model, a woman who could withstand the windstorms of history, a woman who could stay on her feet like the last wall holding off barbarism when all the others were falling. And now Oksana not only knew her poems by heart, but barely modified, she made them reappear in her songs. 3 weeks after their first encounter, the Korean returned to the dive with the same imprudent ease he'd practiced the first time. Oksana sang him the verses she dedicated to him. Don't give me anything to remember you. I know how short memory is. The Korean didn't smile, didn't change expression, paid no attention to her words or the echoes of her guitar. He didn't even fix his needle-like gaze on her. Oksana wanted to forgive him. Now she possesses his secret, and he could not see her as he had before. After 3 or 4 songs, she went over to his table herself. The Russian giant blocked the path to his boss, and if she were a murderer or a beggar, but Oksana would not allow herself to be intimidated. The Korean stopped the physical exchange, whispered a few words to the Russian, and he translated for Oksana. At midnight, same services, same price. The Korean didn't stay until Oksana finished her set, so he missed one of her best songs about a teenager who'd gone missing and a tiger without claws. When she finished, the black car was waiting for her. The Russian glared at her with contempt, almost with sorrow. "You're either a nut or a jerk," he said between his teeth. Oksana ignored him and remained silent during the ride, focused on the snow-covered sidewalks on the darkened buildings. The wind flowing from the Sea of Japan scorched the street lamps and the trees as if it wanted to pull them up by the roots. The sky was black, black. The Korean received again Oksana wearing his purple robe. She stripped diligently, following the pre-established ritual, and allowed him to touch and sniff her. He seemed even more needy than before. Then Oksana stretched out on the bed and made ready to receive him on her belly. But he tried to excite himself on his own before getting into bed with her. His erection only lasted a few seconds. He moved to the side and sat on the bed. Oksana approached him very delicately. He looked as if he might fall apart and caress his cheek. Pretending it was a transaction like any other, the gangster took out his wallet, removed 2 100 bills, and handed them to Oksana. She shook her head in refusal, but he forced her to take them. There was no emotion in his eyes, not even a hint of sorrow or shame. Nothing. Oksana quickly dressed, and it wasn't until she reached the street, whipped by the gusts from the Sea of Japan, that she felt the painful need to shout. Back in her apartment, she discovered that her lungs hadn't stood up to the wind. Fever was burning her skin. This time the heat was working, but her body was shivering as if she were outdoors. Her joints ached, her chest, her throat. She was delirious. For a moment, she thought she was in a room in the Fontanka Palace and thought that she too had brought about the end of an era. Then she dreamed that the tiger without claws was leaping on her. When she awakened the next morning, she found she was covered with sweat. She no longer had fever, but she was coughing as if her lungs were filled with worms. She washed her face, looked in the mirror, and thought she would die. She quickly made some tea and sat down at her desk. Anushka was waiting for her there, sober and brave, with her blue dress and her orange shawl covering her arms. Oksana thought she was looking more and more like her. Her fingers revived. For 2 weeks, Oksana couldn't sing. The doctors at the regional clinic told her that antibiotics were scarce and only gave her enough for a couple of days. Her voice sounded like the bellow of a dying animal. It might well have been. The days she spent in bed, locked up with the shadows and moisture of her Chasovina street flat, Oksana regretted not being able to make her day with the Korean. As absurd as it seemed, she felt she was betraying him. But she wrote as if possessed. She filled the blue notebook and had to use the back of the pages she'd already covered with writing. Now, She no longer spoke about the law